Imagine living in a world where truth feels buried under centuries of tradition, where every direction you turn there are idols carved from stone, wood, and even precious metals worshipped as if they were alive, yet powerless to help or harm. The Arabian Peninsula, vast and untamed, was a land of deserts and trade routes, of poetry and pride, but spiritually starved. Mecca stood at its center, a city famous for commerce, and the Kaaba, the cube-shaped sanctuary said to have been built by Prophet Ibrahim himself. But over time, the Kaaba, a beacon of monotheisms, had been surrounded by 360 idols. Tribes circled it in rituals that lost their original meaning, chanting names of gods that could neither hear nor respond. In the bustling markets of Mecca, wealth and lineage defined status, yet injustice ran deep. The weak were exploited, orphans neglected, women treated as property, and newborn girls sometimes buried alive. Tribal feuds erupted over the smallest of slights, cycles of revenge lasting generations. Into this chaotic world was born a man known simply as Al-Amin, the trustworthy Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a shepherd turned merchant whose honesty was legendary. Even his enemies, those who would later oppose his message with their lives, could not deny his character. He lived quietly, yet he was different. He did not drink, gamble, or bow to idols. He was contemplative, often retreating to the mountains, searching for something greater than the hollow practices of his people. As years passed, his longing for truth only deepened. He saw the suffering of the poor, the arrogance of the rich, and the emptiness of worshiping what the hands of men had carved. His heart yearned for the faith of Ibrahim, the pure worship of one Creator, untainted by superstition. At night, when Mecca slept, he would climb Mount Nur, seeking solitude in the small cave of Hira. There, surrounded by silence and stars, he would ponder creation, questioning his place in this vast universe. Unknown to him, every moment spent in reflection was preparing him for a night that would divide history into two eras, before and after revelation. It was during one of these solitary retreats, in the sacred month of Ramadan, that the unimaginable happened. Alone in the cave, Muhammad was deep in contemplation when a presence unlike any he had ever felt filled the darkness. A voice commanded with authority yet terrifying majesty, "Read." Startled, trembling, he replied, "I cannot read." The command came again, firm and insistent, "Read." Again he protested, "I cannot read." Then, for a third time, the voice enveloped him, pressing upon him with such force that he felt his very soul would burst, and the words rang out, "Read in the name of your Lord, who created man from a clot. Read, and your Lord is the most generous." In that instant, the first verses of the Quran descended upon a man who had never read a single book, and yet would soon carry the greatest book humanity had ever known. Shaken to his core, Muhammad fled the cave, heart pounding, breath ragged, unsure if he was losing his mind. He stumbled down the rocky path of Mount Nur in the dead of night, desperate for comfort. As he reached home, he cried out to Khadijah, his beloved wife, "Cover me, cover me." She wrapped him in a cloak, holding him until the terror subsided. When he finally spoke, he described the voice, the presence, the words that seared into his memory. Khadijah did not doubt him for a second. She had known his honesty all her life, had seen his compassion and his character. She reassured him, "By Allah, he will never disgrace you. You maintain family ties, you bear others' burdens, you help the poor, you honor guests, and you support every noble cause." With those words, she became the first believer in Islam. But reassurance was not enough. Khadijah sought further clarity. She took Muhammad to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, a learned man familiar with the scriptures of the Jews and Christians. After hearing Muhammad's account, Waraka's face lit with recognition. "This is the same angel who came to Moses," he said. "If only I were young when your people drive you out." Muhammad, astonished, asked, "Will they drive me out?" Waraka replied, "No one has ever brought what you have brought except that they were opposed." It was the first glimpse of the trials that awaited him, a foreshadowing of years of struggle and sacrifice. In the days that followed, silence returned. Weeks passed without revelation, leaving Muhammad anxious and yearning. Then suddenly, the angel returned, bringing words of immense weight. "O you who are wrapped up, arise and warn." The call was no longer personal, it was a mission. He was no longer to seek solitude but to face society, to awaken a people asleep in heedlessness. These early revelations were short, urgent, and electrifying, calling to pure monotheism, warning of the day of judgment, and offering mercy for those who repent. They stirred hearts, especially among the humble and oppressed, who found hope in words that spoke of justice and divine compassion. Yet this mission was not without cost. The Quraysh, proud of their idols and their power, saw his message as a threat to their way of life. They mocked him, calling him a poet, a magician, even possessed. But Muhammad was undeterred. Strengthened by Khadijah's unwavering support and the quiet faith of a few companions, he began spreading the message discreetly. Abu Bakr, his closest friend, accepted Islam without hesitation and brought with him many others. Ali, a young boy raised in Muhammad's home, believed as soon as he heard the words. Zayd, the freed slave treated as a son, followed suit. Together, this small group of believers gathered in secret, reciting verses that filled their hearts with awe and peace. In a society drowning in injustice, the Quran's words were a lifeline, calling them to dignity, patience, and a higher purpose. For 3 long years after that first earth-shaking encounter in the cave of Hira, the call to Islam was not shouted from rooftops nor proclaimed in crowded markets. It was whispered quietly in homes, taught in secret gatherings, carried from heart to heart by those brave enough to believe in a single creator when the entire city bowed to idols. Muhammad, now a messenger of God, began carefully inviting those closest to him, family, trusted friends, and neighbors, knowing that even a whisper of this message could provoke anger from Mecca's powerful tribes. Each new revelation descended with profound weight, short yet piercing verses that exposed the emptiness of idol worship and called people back to the pure worship of the one God. These early chapters of the Quran, filled with oaths by the stars, the dawn, and the soul, spoke directly to the human heart, igniting reflection and awe. During this secret phase, the house of a companion named Al-Arqam became a sanctuary for the believers. There, away from the prying eyes of Quraysh, men and women would gather to learn the Quran, sometimes reciting until tears welled in their eyes. Among them were people from all walks of life, noblemen like Abu Bakr, slaves like Bilal, and even the young like Ali ibn Abi Talib. The message resonated deeply with the oppressed, those tired of injustice, those yearning for equality in a world where lineage dictated worth. But this fragile community knew that if the Quraysh discovered their secret, the backlash would be severe. And yet, despite the risk, the number of believers quietly grew, on unshakable brotherhood forming in the shadows of Mecca's idols. For 3 years, the Prophet was patient, waiting for divine instruction to take the message public. Then, a revelation came that changed everything. Warn your closest relatives. It was time to step into the open. Muhammad gathered his clan, the children of Abdul Muttalib, atop a hill and called them to abandon idols and worship the one God. At first, silence filled the air, astonishment that one of their own would challenge centuries of tradition. Then came ridicule and anger, led by his own uncle Abu Lahab, whose bitter opposition would later be immortalized in the Quran's Surah Al-Masad. But Muhammad was undeterred. The command was clear: rise and warn. So he climbed Mount Safa, one of the city's most visible points, and called out to all of Mecca, "If I were to tell you an army is advancing upon you from behind this valley, would you believe me?" They replied, "Yes, we have never known you to lie." Then he said, "I am a warner to you before a severe punishment." The crowd erupted in outrage. "May you be ruined for this," Abu Lahab shouted, storming off in fury. The mockery had begun, but so too had the unstoppable spread of truth. The Quraysh were shaken. Muhammad's message threatened their religious authority, their wealth from pilgrimages to the idols, and the delicate balance of tribal power. They tried to stop him with bribes, offering wealth, status, and even kingship if he would only abandon his call. But he replied with words that still echo across centuries, "If they placed the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not abandon this mission." The Quran continued to reveal verses that emboldened the believers and exposed the arrogance of their opponents. Its language was unlike any poetry Mecca had heard, majestic yet piercing, comforting yet challenging. Some hearts softened immediately upon hearing it, while others hardened in pride and hostility. Persecution soon followed. Those who were weak and without tribal protection, like Bilal, faced the harshest torment. He was dragged into the scorching desert, pinned beneath heavy stones, and whipped under the blazing sun. Yet he refused to renounce his faith, crying out, "Ahad, Ahad, one, one," in defiance of his tormentors. Others were beaten, starved, and mocked in public. Families were divided, fathers turned against sons, and mothers against daughters. Still, the revelations urged patience and promised reward for those who endured. Indeed, with hardship comes ease. The early Muslims' secret meetings could no longer stay hidden. As the message spread, so too did the Quraysh's outrage. Public insults escalated to threats, threats escalated to violence, and yet the believers held firm. When the Prophet walked through the marketplace, he was mocked, stones were thrown, and animal entrails were dumped on his back while he prayed. But even in these humiliations, the Quran offered solace, calling him to patience and reminding him of previous prophets who faced similar scorn. These verses transformed despair into resilience, assuring that truth, no matter how resisted, would prevail. The tension reached a breaking point. Quraysh leaders convened and agreed this message could no longer be ignored. If persuasion failed, then persecution must succeed. This marked the beginning of an era of open hostility, where believers were ostracized, starved, and in some cases, martyred for refusing to abandon their faith. Yet the more Quraysh tried to silence the Quran, the more its words spread, whispered in homes, recited in secret, carried in the hearts of those willing to risk everything for the truth they now tasted. In this phase of open proclamation, a remarkable shift occurred. The Quran's verses began addressing not just belief, but also the moral and social corruption of Meccan society. It condemned the hoarding of wealth, the mistreatment of orphans, and the burying of infant girls alive. It called for justice, mercy, and humility. These teachings were revolutionary in a culture defined by tribal pride and materialism, and they drew both admiration and fierce resistance. As the message gained followers from all classes, rich and poor, noble and enslaved, the Quraysh realized they were facing not just a spiritual movement, but a social revolution threatening to overturn their entire way of life. Despite relentless opposition, the Prophet continued to deliver the message with unwavering resolve. The secret years had forged a core of believers whose faith could withstand any trial, and the open call ignited a movement that would soon outgrow Mecca's walls. In the face of insult, torture, and exile, the Quran's words gave them courage, reminding them that those who stood for truth in the past, Noah, Abraham, Moses, had endured similar struggles and emerged victorious by God's will. With every revelation, hope was rekindled. The believers knew that their suffering was not in vain, that a day of justice was approaching, and that the words descending from the heavens were not merely to be recited, they were to be lived. The persecution in Mecca reached a point where life became unbearable for the early Muslims. Those without strong tribal protection suffered the most. Slaves and the poor were beaten, starved, and humiliated in the streets for merely whispering the name of Allah. Families were torn apart as fathers disowned sons, mothers disowned daughters, and friends betrayed friends. The Quraysh saw Islam not just as a spiritual challenge, but as a threat to their entire social order, undermining their idols and the wealth they gained from pilgrimage trade. The believers were a small group, fragile in numbers yet unshakable in faith. Among them were men and women whose names would be etched forever in history. Bilal, who endured burning stones on his chest while crying, "Ahad, Ahad." Sumayya, who became the first martyr after refusing to renounce her belief, and Yasir, who was killed alongside her. Their blood was shed in the sands of Mecca, and the Prophet could only whisper, "Be patient, for your meeting place is paradise." Amid this storm of persecution, a solution emerged, unexpected and extraordinary. Across the Red Sea lay the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, ruled by a just king known as the Negus. Word reached the Muslims that this ruler did not tolerate injustice and offered refuge to the oppressed, regardless of their faith. The Prophet, concerned for the safety of his followers, advised some of them to migrate secretly to this distant land where they could worship freely. It was a heart-wrenching decision. Leaving Mecca meant leaving behind their homes, families, and everything familiar. Yet their love for Allah outweighed every worldly attachment. Quietly, under the cover of night, men, women, and children slipped out of Mecca in small groups, making their way toward the coast to board ships bound for Abyssinia. This was the first migration in Islam, an event that demonstrated both the severity of the persecution and the unwavering resolve of the believers. When news of the migration reached Quraysh leaders, panic set in. The idea that their former slaves and companions might find sanctuary and spread Islam in foreign lands enraged them. They dispatched envoys laden with gifts to the Negus, hoping to persuade him to hand over the refugees. Standing in the royal court of Abyssinia, the Quraysh emissaries painted the Muslims as rebels who had abandoned the religion of their ancestors and brought discord to Mecca. But when the Negus summoned the Muslims to explain themselves, something extraordinary happened. One of the emigrants, Jafar ibn Abi Talib, recited verses from Surah Maryam describing the miraculous birth of Jesus and the purity of Mary. The words of the Quran, melodic and profound, moved the Negus and his priests to tears. He declared, "This and what Jesus brought come from the same source," and refused to hand them over. For the first time, Islam found protection beyond the borders of Arabia, a sign that its message transcended tribes and nations. Back in Mecca, the Quraysh were furious at their failure to retrieve the refugees. Their hostility toward the Muslims only intensified. It was during this time that another wave of hardship struck, an economic and social boycott imposed on the Prophet and his supporters. The clans that protected Muhammad, though not all believers themselves, were targeted. An agreement was drawn up, sealed, and hung in the Kaaba. No one would trade with them, marry them, or speak to them until they surrendered the Prophet. With nowhere else to go, Muhammad and his followers were forced into a narrow valley known as the Shayab of Abu Talib. There, they lived in near starvation for 3 long years. The cries of hungry children echoed through the desert nights. Leaves, dried leather, and whatever scraps they could find became their food. The boycott was so severe that some believers fainted from hunger, and even basic medicine was denied to them. Despite the unimaginable suffering, the Quran continued to descend with words of solace and strength. Verses reminded the believers of the trials faced by earlier prophets: Noah mocked by his people, Abraham cast into the fire, Moses pursued by Pharaoh. These stories were not just history, they were lifelines, showing that endurance leads to triumph and that God's promise never fails. Even amid deprivation, the Muslims held on to their faith with greater conviction than ever. Their resolve bewildered the Quraysh, who could not understand how words' mere recitations could inspire such sacrifice. After 3 years, the boycott came to an unexpected end. A revelation reached the prophet that the agreement hung in the Kaaba had been eaten by insects, leaving only the name of Allah intact. When this was verified, even some among Quraysh were moved by the injustice of the boycott and pressured its end. Slowly, the Muslims emerged from the valley, physically weakened but spiritually unbreakable. Yet relief was short-lived, for soon after came one of the Prophet's most painful personal trials, the year of sorrow. In the same year, 2 of his greatest supporters passed away: Abu Talib, his protective uncle, and Khadijah, his beloved wife and companion. Their deaths left him exposed to increased hostility and deep personal grief. Seeking solace and support, the Prophet journeyed to the nearby city of Ta'if to invite its people to Islam. But instead of welcome, he was met with ridicule and violence. The people of Ta'if sent their children to pelt him with stones until his feet bled. He fled to a garden, where, sitting under a tree, he raised his hands in one of the most heartfelt prayers ever recorded. "O Allah, to you I complain of my weakness, my lack of resources, and my humiliation before the people. If you are not angry with me, I care not what I face." It was in this moment of despair that divine comfort arrived in a form more wondrous than ever before. The Prophet experienced the miraculous night journey and ascension, Isra and Miraj, where he was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem and then through the heavens. He met earlier prophets, witnessed the unseen realms, and was given the gift of 5 daily prayers, a spiritual anchor for his followers. This journey was a reminder that even in humanity's lowest moments, God's mercy is near, and that hardship is often followed by blessings beyond imagination. The trials of Abyssinia and the boycott were turning points in the early history of Islam. They forged a community bound not by blood but by faith, willing to endure exile, hunger, and pain for a cause greater than themselves. They showed that the Quran was not merely a book to be recited, but a force that transformed hearts, inspired courage, and united people across tribes and borders. The words revealed in those years continue to echo through time, offering solace to anyone who feels cornered by life's trials, reminding them that patience and trust in the divine always lead to light after darkness. The years of boycott had left their mark on the Muslims, carving into their bodies the evidence of hunger and hardship, but also strengthening their hearts in ways their enemies could not comprehend. Yet just as they emerged from that valley of suffering, another wave of sorrow struck the Prophet with a force more devastating than any physical torment he had endured before. Within a short span of months, he lost the 2 pillars of comfort and protection in his life. Abu Talib, the uncle who had shielded him from Quraysh hostility despite never embracing Islam, passed away first. Only days later, Khadijah, the beloved wife who had been his companion, confidant, and first believer, breathed her last. Her absence left a void so deep that this year would forever be known as the year of sorrow. The Prophet walked the streets of Mecca now fully exposed, no longer protected by tribal bonds nor soothed by the gentle words of the woman who had believed in him when no one else would. Quraysh, emboldened by Abu Talib's death, intensified their hostility. Insults became harsher, physical assaults more frequent, and the Prophet's solitude grew heavier with each passing day. Seeking solace and perhaps a new sanctuary for his message, Muhammad turned his gaze to the nearby city of Ta'if, hoping its people might receive him with the openness Mecca denied. The journey there was long and heavy with hope, but what awaited him was cruelty almost beyond comprehension. Instead of welcome, the leaders of Ta'if mocked him, dismissed his words, and incited their children and servants to chase him out. Stones were hurled at him until his feet bled and his sandals filled with blood. Bruised, exhausted, and humiliated, he found shelter in an orchard on the outskirts of the city. It was here, under the shade of a tree, that he raised one of the most heartfelt supplications ever recorded, a prayer that still resonates with believers who feel broken and alone. O Allah, to you I complain of my weakness, my helplessness, and my humiliation before people. If you are not angry with me, I care not what I face. Yet your mercy is more expansive for me. I seek refuge in the light of your face, by which all darkness is dispelled, and every matter of this world and the next is set right. In that moment of utter vulnerability, divine reassurance descended not through relief from hardship, but through an unimaginable gift that would lift his spirit beyond the limits of this world. One night, as he lay in Mecca still reeling from sorrow, the heavens split open in a journey unlike any other. The angel Jibreel appeared once more, bringing with him the Buraq, a radiant steed swifter than lightning. Muhammad mounted it, and in an instant, he was carried from the sacred mosque in Mecca to the farthest mosque in Jerusalem, a city sacred to prophets before him. There, he led them all in prayer, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and countless others in act, symbolizing the unity of divine messages throughout history. But this was only the beginning. From Jerusalem, he ascended beyond the earthly realm, passing through the seven heavens in a journey known as the Miraj. In the first heaven, he met Adam, the father of mankind, greeting him with peace. In the second, he met John and Jesus. In the third, Joseph. In the fourth, Idris. In the fifth, Aaron. In the sixth, Moses. And in the seventh, Abraham, who stood leaning against the Kaaba of paradise itself. Each prophet welcomed him, affirming his role as the seal of prophets, the final messenger completing what they had begun. Beyond the seventh heaven, Muhammad was taken to the lote tree of the utmost boundary, a place so magnificent even the angel Jibreel could not pass. It was here that the prophet experienced what no other creation had an audience with the divine. Words cannot capture what he saw, for no human eye has beheld it, nor human tongue fully described it. But from this meeting came one of the greatest blessings for his followers, the command of prayer. Initially prescribed as 50 daily prayers, it was, through the prophet's humble pleas and Moses' counsel, reduced to 5, yet retaining the reward of 50. This was not merely a ritual, it was a gift, a direct connection between the Creator and his servants, a means for hearts to ascend spiritually just as the prophet had ascended physically. Upon returning to Mecca, the prophet shared his miraculous journey, and as expected, Quraysh mocked him relentlessly. They scoffed at the impossibility of traveling to Jerusalem and back in a single night, let alone ascending to the heavens. Yet when they tested him, asking for descriptions of Jerusalem, a place he had never visited in earthly life, he recounted its details with precision, details confirmed by travelers who had seen it. Among the believers, this event deepened faith. Among the skeptics, it hardened disbelief. But for those who understood, the night journey was not just a miracle of distance, but a revelation of closeness to God in worship, in patience, and in unwavering trust during life's darkest hours. This period, though marked by profound grief, became a turning point. The prophet had been tested with isolation, rejection, and heartbreak, but he was now being prepared for a greater mission beyond Mecca's walls. The ascension to the heavens was not an escape from suffering. It was a message that beyond every trial lies elevation, and beyond every hardship lies nearness to God. For the small band of Muslims still enduring persecution, this event ignited renewed hope. It reminded them that their struggle was part of a divine plan stretching far beyond what their eyes could see, a plan rooted in mercy and destined for victory. With this renewed resolve, the prophet would soon find a new home for the message, a city where faith would not merely survive but thrive, where the Quran's teachings would shape laws, hearts, and an entire civilization. The journey through sorrow was about to give way to the journey of transformation as the story of Islam prepared to enter its next chapter. As the years of struggle in Mecca dragged on, the hostility of Quraysh reached a fever pitch. Every day, the Prophet's call to worship one God was met with scorn, threats, and even physical harm. Yet amid this storm, a new ray of hope emerged from an unexpected place, the oasis city of Yathrib, later to be known as Medina. Yathrib was plagued by deep tribal rivalries between the Aus and Khazraj clans, whose endless feuds had left the city fractured and weary of bloodshed. Their hearts yearned for a unifying leader, someone who could rise above tribal lines and bring peace to their torn community. When they heard whispers of a man in Mecca claiming prophethood, a man known for his honesty and wisdom, their curiosity was piqued. It was during the pilgrimage season that a small group from Yathrib encountered Muhammad and listened to the Quran for the first time. The verses struck them with a force they could not ignore, words unlike any poetry, carrying a purity and depth that resonated with their longing for truth. The following year, they returned with more companions, meeting the Prophet secretly at a place called Aqaba. There, under the cover of night, they pledged allegiance to him, promising to worship none but Allah, to avoid theft, murder, and injustice, and to stand by him in times of ease and hardship. This was the first pledge of Aqaba, a quiet yet monumental turning point in Islamic history. When they returned to Yathrib, they began spreading the message, preparing the ground for something far greater. By the next pilgrimage season, their numbers had grown significantly. More than 70 men and women from Yathrib came to pledge themselves to the Prophet, offering not just their faith but their protection. This second pledge of Aqaba was profound. They promised to defend him as they would defend their own families, to fight alongside him if necessary, and to establish a new community based on faith and justice. With these pledges, the path for migration was opened. The small persecuted group of Muslims in Mecca now had a refuge, a place where Islam could grow without chains. The command for migration, known as the Hijra, came at a time when Quraysh were plotting the Prophet's assassination. Their frustration with his message had boiled over. They conspired to choose a warrior from each clan, strike him simultaneously, and shed his blood collectively so that no single tribe could be blamed. But divine revelation exposed their plan, and the Prophet prepared to leave under the cover of night. Entrusting Ali to sleep in his bed as a decoy, he slipped away with Abu Bakr, beginning a journey that would mark the dawn of a new era. The two companions hid in the cave of Thar for 3 nights while Quraysh searched desperately, scouring the hills and valleys. At one point, their pursuers came so close that only a spider's web and a dove's nest at the cave's entrance concealed them. Abu Bakr, whispering in fear, worried they would be discovered, but the Prophet reassured him with words immortalized in the Quran. "Do not be sad. Indeed, Allah is with us." That assurance calmed hearts then, and continues to calm hearts today. After days of perilous travel, dodging patrols and surviving the harsh desert, the Prophet and his followers arrived safely in Yathrib. Their arrival was met with unprecedented joy. Men, women, and children lined the streets singing praises, welcoming the messenger of Allah with open arms. Palm trees swayed in the warm breeze, and hearts were lightened, as if history itself sighed in relief. Yathrib, from that day forward, would no longer be known by its old name. It became Al-Madina Al-Munawwara, the radiant city, Medina, illuminated by the light of prophethood. The migration was not merely a change of location, it was the birth of a new chapter in human history. So significant was this event that it would later mark the beginning of the Islamic calendar. With Medina as their base, the Muslims could finally practice their faith openly. But more than just a safe haven, Medina became the blueprint for a just and moral society. Upon arrival, the Prophet's first task was to establish bonds between the emigrants from Mecca, known as the Muhajirun, and the native helpers of Medina, the Ansar. These bonds were not mere symbolic gestures. They were deep, practical partnerships. One Ansari would pair with one Muhajir, sharing his home, wealth, and livelihood, treating him as family. This brotherhood transcended tribal boundaries and shattered the divisions that had long plagued Arabia. The Quran praised this unity, describing how the Ansar loved those who emigrated to them and gave preference to others even when they themselves were in need. Another foundational act was the drafting of the Constitution of Medina, a groundbreaking document in world history. It laid out rights and responsibilities for all citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, ensuring religious freedom and collective defense. Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all part of this covenant, bound to mutual protection and justice. The Prophet established Medina as a pluralistic city-state, a model of coexistence at a time when such concepts were unheard of. Through these measures, the scattered tribes of Yathrib transformed into a unified community, the first Islamic society, built on principles of faith, compassion, and justice, rather than lineage and power. As the Muslims settled into their new lives, revelation continued to descend, guiding them in matters both spiritual and societal. In Medina, the Quran began introducing laws and ethics that would shape the daily lives of believers. Instructions on prayer, fasting, charity, family rights, and commerce. It addressed disputes, uplifted the oppressed, and laid the groundwork for a balanced life centered on worship and service. These verses were no longer just calls to faith in the face of persecution. They were blueprints for building a thriving community rooted in divine guidance. For the first time, Islam was not merely surviving, it was flourishing. Yet peace was not absolute. The Quraysh of Mecca, enraged by the Prophet's escape and the growing strength of the Muslims, vowed to destroy this new community. The migration had only shifted the battlefield. The struggle for survival was far from over. But Medina had something Mecca never did: a united people, a divine mission, and a vision of justice that would soon reshape the entire Arabian Peninsula. The stage was now set for the next great trials, the battles that would test their resolve, solidify their brotherhood, and prove to the world that faith in one God could overcome the mightiest of foes. The peace of Medina was short-lived. Though the Muslims had found safety and a new beginning, Mecca's leaders could not tolerate their growing influence. Caravans filled with Quraysh wealth still traveled north toward Syria, passing dangerously close to Medina's borders. These trade routes were the lifeblood of Mecca's economy, and now, under constant threat of conflict, they became a focal point in the escalating struggle between the believers and their former persecutors. It was in this tense climate that the first major confrontation of Islam unfolded, the Battle of Badr. This was not simply a clash of armies, but a collision between two worldviews, one clinging to centuries of idolatry and tribal pride, the other carrying a new revelation proclaiming justice, mercy, and the worship of one God. News reached the Prophet that a caravan led by Abu Sufyan was returning from Syria, heavily laden with goods. A small Muslim force set out to intercept it, not with intentions of plunder but to reclaim some of the wealth that had been unjustly seized when they were driven from Mecca. However, Quraysh learned of this plan and mobilized a powerful army of nearly 1,000 men to protect the caravan and crush the Muslims once and for all. The believers numbered only about 300 and were poorly equipped, many without armor or even proper weapons. Fear and anticipation mingled in their hearts as they camped near the wells of Badr. In that night of uneasy silence, the Prophet raised his hands in a prayer so intense that it echoed across the battlefield. "O Allah, if this group perishes today, you will not be worshipped on this earth." His tears fell into the sand as he begged for divine support, and the Quran answered, "I will reinforce you with 1,000 angels following one another." These words lifted the hearts of the believers. When dawn broke, the two forces met. The Quraysh, confident in their numbers, roared across the plain, but the Muslims stood firm, united under their faith. The battle began with single combat, 3 champions from each side stepping forward to fight. Then chaos erupted as the armies clashed. Against all odds, the Muslims prevailed. Angels, unseen by human eyes, struck terror into the hearts of the enemy. By day's end, 70 Quraysh lay dead, including many of their most prominent leaders, and 70 more were taken captive. The victory was decisive, a shock to Arabia, and a clear sign that divine aid accompanied the Prophet. The Quran would later describe this day as Yawm al-Furqan, the day of criterion where truth was distinguished from falsehood. For the Muslims, Badr was not just a military triumph, but a profound validation of their faith, a turning point proving that the small persecuted community in Medina was destined for something far greater. But triumph is often followed by trial. The following year, the Quraysh were determined to avenge their humiliation. They gathered an army 3 times larger than before, 3,000 men marching toward Medina with vengeance burning in their hearts. The Muslims, now numbering around 700, prepared for battle at the foot of Mount Uhud. Unlike Badr, where victory came unexpectedly, this confrontation would test them in ways they had never imagined. The Prophet carefully positioned 50 archers on a strategic hill, instructing them not to abandon their post no matter what happened, whether the Muslims were winning or losing. Their task was critical: to guard the rear of the army against a possible cavalry attack. The battle began, and once again, the Muslims fought with remarkable courage. Slowly, the Quraysh ranks began to crumble, and victory seemed within reach. The enemy retreated, leaving behind spoils of war. But then came a moment that would change everything. Seeing the Quraysh flee, many of the archers, believing the battle won, abandoned their positions to collect the spoils despite the Prophet's explicit command. Khalid ibn al-Walid, a skilled cavalry commander fighting for the Quraysh at the time, seized this opening. With his mounted troops, he circled around the hill and struck the Muslims from behind. Panic spread through the ranks. Confusion turned triumph into chaos. The Prophet himself was injured, his helmet shattered, his face bleeding, and rumors spread that he had been killed. Morale plummeted, and the believers scattered in disarray. Yet amid the chaos, small groups rallied around the Prophet, shielding him with their bodies and fighting desperately to protect him. Men and women alike displayed acts of astonishing bravery, standing firm while others fled. By the end of the battle, 70 Muslims had been martyred, including the Prophet's beloved uncle Hamza, whose body was brutally mutilated by the enemy. The grief was immense, but the lesson was even greater. Revelation descended, explaining that the defeat at Uhud was not a sign of abandonment, but a test. The Quran reminded them that obedience brings victory and disobedience invites hardship, that prophets before had endured setbacks, and that perseverance through trials leads to ultimate success. The aftermath of Uhud was sobering. Medina mourned its martyrs, yet the community emerged wiser and more disciplined. The Quran's verses during this period instilled patience and reflection, urging believers not to despair. The message was clear: victory and defeat are both from Allah, and every hardship carries within it a lesson. These battles were not merely about swords and shields, they were about shaping character, forging unity, and preparing the believers for the monumental mission ahead. Even in loss, the Muslims were not broken. Their faith remained unshaken, their bond stronger than ever. The Quran continued to descend, verse by verse, guiding them through grief and reminding them of the eternal reward awaiting those who remain steadfast. This resilience would soon be tested again, for the Quraysh were not finished, and greater challenges loomed on the horizon, challenges that would push Medina to its limits and set the stage for one of the most extraordinary sieges in Arabian history. The wounds of Uhud had barely begun to heal when Medina faced yet another existential threat. The Quraysh, humiliated by their mixed results at Uhud and emboldened by alliances with neighboring tribes, resolved to wipe out the Muslims once and for all. This time, their plan was not a single army, but a coalition and unprecedented confederation of tribes and factions bound by one goal: the complete destruction of Muhammad and his followers. The Quraysh rallied their allies from across Arabia, including the Ghatafan and other powerful tribes, amassing an army of over 10,000 warriors. For the small community in Medina, this was not just another battle. It was a siege that threatened to erase them from existence. When news of the approaching force reached the Prophet, the urgency was palpable. Medina lacked the numbers to meet such an army in open battle, and a conventional defense would be hopeless. But inspiration came from an unexpected source, a Persian companion named Salman al-Farisi, who suggested digging a massive trench around the exposed parts of Medina. This was an unheard-of tactic in Arabia, foreign to the desert warfare of tribal raids, yet it was ingenious. Under the Prophet's leadership, the Muslims labored day and night in the biting cold, their hands blistered and bodies exhausted, carving a deep trench across the rocky soil. The Prophet himself joined in the digging, lifting stones, chanting supplications, and encouraging his companions with every strike of the pickaxe. In those long days of toil, verses of the Quran descended, promising relief to the steadfast and victory to those who trust in Allah. When the Confederate forces finally arrived, they were stunned. Accustomed to swift raids and open field combat, they found themselves halted by a barrier they could neither cross nor bypass. Frustration mounted as days turned into weeks, the siege dragging on under harsh conditions. Supplies dwindled, morale wavered, and the biting wind cut through their tents at night. Inside Medina, fear and hunger tested the believers. Hypocrites among them spread rumors, whispering that God's promise of victory was empty and that doom was inevitable. Yet the Quran recorded this moment vividly, describing how the hearts of the believers reached their throats and how they looked upon the trench as both trial and testament of faith. Despite the terror, the Muslims stood firm, guarding the trench day and night, repelling every attempted breach with unyielding resolve. Among the Confederates was a tribe once allied with Medinatha Banu Qurayza who, swayed by Quraysh promises, broke their pact and plotted treachery from within. Their betrayal struck deep fear, for it threatened the city from both sides, yet divine intervention arrived in a way none could have predicted. Fierce winds swept through the enemy camp, overturning tents, extinguishing fires, and sowing chaos. The Confederates, plagued by internal mistrust and disheartened by their fruitless siege, began to withdraw in defeat. The Quran would later immortalize this moment, declaring that God himself had sent the winds and unseen forces to drive them away. This battle, remembered as the Battle of the Trench or the Battle of the Confederates, was less a clash of swords than a test of patience and strategy, a testament that faith and resilience could withstand even the mightiest of coalitions. With the Confederates dispersed, a new chapter unfolded in the struggle between Mecca and Medina. The Muslims, though still small in number, had survived every attempt to annihilate them. Their endurance and moral clarity began to shift the balance of power across Arabia. It was in this changing landscape that an extraordinary event occurred, an event that at first appeared as humiliation, but was later revealed to be one of the greatest victories in Islamic history, the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. In the 6th year after the migration, the Prophet set out with his companions, intending to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. They carried no weapons for battle, only the simple provisions and sacrificial animals required for worship. Clad in the garments of Ihram, their intention was purely peaceful: to visit the Kaaba, the house built by Abraham and Ishmael, and fulfill an ancient rite now denied to them by Quraysh hostility. As they approached Mecca, however, Quraysh barred their entry, sending armed riders to block the pilgrims from entering the city. Tensions mounted as negotiations dragged on, and for days, the Muslims camped at a place called Hudaybiyyah, uncertain if bloodshed would erupt. Eventually, a treaty was drafted. Its terms seemed lopsided. The Muslims would return to Medina without performing the pilgrimage that year, but would be allowed to return the following year for 3 days. Any Meccan who fled to Medina without guardian consent would be returned to Mecca, but not vice versa. Many companions were disheartened by these conditions, feeling humiliated and wondering why they had agreed to what appeared a surrender. Yet the Prophet accepted the treaty, seeing beyond the immediate terms to the broader strategy. Revelation soon confirmed his insight. Indeed, we have given you a clear victory. This treaty, though seemingly unfavorable, opened a period of peace that allowed Islam to spread rapidly without the constant shadow of war. Tribes that had stood on the sidelines now witnessed the Muslims as a rising force, bound by law and principle, not chaos and vengeance. The months following Hudaybiyyah proved the wisdom of this truce. Freed from perpetual conflict, the Muslims reached out to neighboring tribes and even foreign rulers, sending letters inviting kings and emperors to Islam. Their message traveled to the courts of Byzantium, Persia, and Abyssinia, planting seeds that would later blossom far beyond Arabia's deserts. Meanwhile, the Quraysh, bound by the treaty they themselves had signed, were forced to watch as Islam grew stronger day by day, attracting allies and reshaping the political map of the region. Yet Hudaybiyyah was not merely a diplomatic milestone. It was a spiritual triumph. It demonstrated restraint when anger was easy, patience when pride demanded retaliation, and trust in divine wisdom when human foresight failed. The companions, who once questioned the treaty's fairness, later saw it for what it truly was, the doorway to a victory greater than any they could have imagined, a peaceful conquest of hearts that would soon lead to the conquest of Mecca itself. The years of tension after Hudaybiyyah simmered with an uneasy calm. For the first time in years, the swords of Quraysh and the Muslims rested, but hearts still burned with memories of bloodshed. The treaty, though binding, was fragile, and both sides watched each other warily. In this breathing space, Islam flourished. Tribes across Arabia, no longer pressured by Meccan hostility, approached Medina in growing numbers to learn about the new faith. The balance of power began to shift. Where once the Muslims were the hunted, they were now recognized as a rising force. Yet Mecca still loomed as the heart of Arabia, its idols crowding the Kaaba, its leaders clinging desperately to the old ways. The day would come when these two worlds collided, but it would arrive not through ambition or conquest, but through betrayal. 2 years after the treaty, a fragile peace was shattered. One of Quraysh's allied tribes, in violation of Hudaybiyyah's terms, launched a treacherous night attack on a Muslim allied tribe, killing men in cold blood and seeking sanctuary in Mecca afterward. This blatant breach of the pact forced the Prophet to act. The Muslims had kept every condition faithfully, but Quraysh's betrayal could not go unanswered. Quietly, preparations began. Unlike the hasty skirmishes of earlier years, this would be a deliberate and decisive march, a culmination of patience, strategy, and divine promise. The Prophet called upon allies, rallying 10,000 believers, the largest force Arabia had ever seen. What made this army extraordinary was not just its size, but its unity. Men who once fought each other at Badr and Uhud now stood shoulder to shoulder under the banner of one God. Tribes reconciled through faith rather than bloodlines. The march toward Mecca was deliberate and disciplined, cloaked in secrecy to avoid bloodshed. As they approached, campfires lit the horizon, thousands of flames flickering in the night sky. Quraysh, caught off guard by the sheer scale of the approaching force, felt fear ripple through their ranks. Abu Sufyan, the longtime adversary of Islam, ventured out to negotiate. Once a staunch enemy, he now stood humbled before the Prophet, witnessing firsthand the mercy and justice that had fueled this movement. He embraced Islam not out of coercion, but out of recognition that the truth he had fought so long was undeniable. When the army entered Mecca, it was not with the vengeance of victors, but with the humility of worshippers. There were no massacres, no plundering, no humiliation of the defeated. The Prophet's head bowed in gratitude as he entered the city, riding not in arrogance but in submission to God's promise fulfilled. His first act was to cleanse the Kaaba, breaking the idols that had stood for centuries. One by one, the lifeless statues fell to the ground as he recited the Quranic verse, "Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish." The people of Mecca, many of whom had persecuted him for over 2 decades, braced for retribution. Instead, they heard words that stunned them. "Go, for you are free." This unparalleled forgiveness softened hearts more than any sword could have. Many embraced Islam that very day, recognizing that no conqueror in history had ever shown such mercy. Mecca, once the epicenter of hostility, became the center of faith. The Kaaba was restored to its original sanctity as a house of monotheism, just as Abraham and Ishmael had intended. Pilgrimage was purified from pagan rituals, realigned with the worship of the one Creator. This conquest was unlike any other, not a mere military victory, but a moral and spiritual triumph, signaling the dawn of a new era for Arabia. In the months that followed, the Prophet's mission neared completion. The tribes of Arabia, witnessing the fall of Mecca and the rapid spread of Islam, came in delegations to Medina to pledge allegiance. What had begun as a quiet call in a cave now resonated across the peninsula, transforming hearts and societies alike. Yet one final chapter remained, a farewell not of defeat but of completion. In the 10th year after migration, the Prophet announced he would perform Hajj, the pilgrimage, inviting the community to join him. Over 100,000 Muslims gathered, converging on the sacred sanctuary. This was not just a ritual pilgrimage, it was a living culmination of Abraham's prayer and Muhammad's mission, a moment where the new Muslim Ummah stood united under the guidance of revelation. During this farewell pilgrimage, the Prophet delivered a sermon that would echo through history. Standing on the plain of Arafat, he addressed the crowd in words that summarized the essence of Islam and charted the course for generations to come. He reminded them of the sanctity of life, property, and honor, declaring them as sacred as the day and place itself. He abolished the lingering practices of vengeance and usury, proclaiming equality among all people regardless of tribe or race. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab over an Arab, except by piety. He entrusted them with the Quran and his example, warning them to hold fast to these 2 sources lest they go astray. And perhaps most powerfully, he affirmed the completion of the divine mission with the verse revealed that day. "Today I have perfected your religion for you, completed my favor upon you, and chosen Islam as your way." Tears flowed freely among the companions, realizing this was both a moment of triumph and a prelude to farewell. As the pilgrimage concluded, the Prophet returned to Medina, his mission fulfilled. He had guided a people from ignorance to faith, from division to unity, from tribalism to a moral community bound by divine purpose. Soon after, he would fall ill, departing this world with the words, "O Allah, the highest companion," upon his lips. But the message he left behind, the Quran, the example of his life, the bonds of brotherhood forged in faith, would endure, carrying light across continents and centuries. What began in a lonely cave had transformed the course of human history, and its impact continues to guide hearts to this very day. The return from the farewell pilgrimage was bittersweet. The Prophet's companions were still basking in the glow of unity, feeling as though the mission had reached its culmination, unaware that the messenger of Allah was nearing the end of his earthly journey. The signs were subtle yet undeniable. His strength, once unshakable in battle and tireless in devotion, began to wane. In the months following Hajj, illness slowly overcame him. Fever gripped his body, his pain evident to those closest to him, yet he continued leading the community with patience and humility. Even in his final days, his concern was not for himself but for the message he had been entrusted to deliver and the Ummah that would inherit it. As his illness worsened, he asked to be cared for in the home of Aisha. There, in the modest room attached to the mosque, he spent his last days, often drifting in and out of consciousness, still reminding those around him of prayer and justice. The companions gathered, grief-stricken, yet clinging to every word. In moments of clarity, he warned them against returning to pre-Islamic ways of oppression and tribal arrogance, urging them to uphold the sanctity of brotherhood. He emphasized again and again, prayer, prayer, and what your right hands possess, a final reminder of devotion to God and kindness to those under one's care. The news of his declining health rippled through Medina. People prayed fervently, hoping for his recovery, while some refused to believe that death could approach the messenger of Allah. On the final Monday of his life, he parted the curtain of his room to glance at the congregation in prayer. The sight filled him with serenity. Seeing the believers standing shoulder to shoulder, led by Abu Bakr, was a vision of the community he had built, a people united by faith, no longer defined by tribe or bloodline, but by devotion to the one God. A faint smile crossed his lips before he let the curtain fall. Moments later, as the morning light filled the small room, he whispered his final words, "O Allah, the highest companion," and returned to his Lord. The silence that followed was unlike any Medina had ever known. Grief swept through the city like a storm. Umar, overcome by shock, unsheathed his sword and declared that anyone claiming the Prophet had died would face his wrath, insisting instead that he had gone to meet his Lord as Moses once had. It was Abu Bakr who steadied the hearts of the people. Climbing to address the crowd, he recited words from the Quran revealed years earlier. Muhammad is but a messenger. Messengers have passed away before him. If he dies or is killed, will you turn back on your heels? As the verse settled over them, reality sank in. The Prophet was gone, but the message remained eternal. The question of leadership arose immediately. The Ummah, still reeling from loss, gathered at Saqifa to decide who would guide them forward. After deliberation, the companions pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr as the first caliph of Islam. His leadership, though unexpected by some, was marked by calm resolve and an unwavering commitment to preserving the unity of the community and the sanctity of the Quran. One of his first monumental tasks would be ensuring that the Quran, the revelation that had descended over 23 years in fragments, in response to events and questions, in times of joy and trial, was preserved in a single, unified compilation. In the wake of the Prophet's death, danger loomed on multiple fronts. False prophets arose, tribes rebelled, and wars erupted in Arabia. Among these conflicts was the Battle of Yamama, where dozens of the Quran's memorizers, men who had committed the entire revelation to heart, were martyred. This loss struck the companions with fear. If more Hafaz were killed, parts of the Quran might vanish from living memory. Umar ibn al-Khattab approached Abu Bakr with a proposal both urgent and unprecedented: to collect the Quran into a single written manuscript. At first, Abu Bakr hesitated, uneasy about initiating something the Prophet himself had not done. But after reflection and prayer, he recognized the necessity of this effort to safeguard the revelation for generations to come. Abu Bakr entrusted this monumental task to Zayd ibn Thabit, a young companion renowned for his memory and precision. Zayd approached the work with awe and reverence, describing it later as more weighty than moving a mountain. He meticulously gathered verses from parchments, leather, bone, and the hearts of those who had memorized them. Every fragment was cross-verified by witnesses who had heard it directly from the Prophet's own recitation. Nothing was accepted unless confirmed beyond doubt. Slowly, painstakingly, the Quran was compiled in its entirety, arranged in the order divinely inspired to the Prophet, and preserved exactly as it had been revealed. The completion of this manuscript ensured that the Quran, the very words of God, would remain untouched and unaltered. During Abu Bakr's lifetime, it was kept secure and later passed to Umar and then to Hafsa, the Prophet's widow. Years later, as Islam spread far beyond Arabia into lands with diverse dialects, Caliph Uthman would commission standardized copies to be sent across the expanding Muslim world, ensuring the unity of recitation and preventing disputes. This act would forever safeguard the Quran from the distortions and fragmentations that had befallen previous scriptures. What began in the quiet solitude of the cave of Hira was now preserved in the hearts of thousands and bound within a single codex. The words that had transformed Arabia, calling a people from darkness to light, from tribal vengeance to universal brotherhood, were now set to guide humanity until the end of time. The mission of the Prophet was complete, yet its impact was only beginning. As Islam spread across continents, carried by merchants, scholars, and seekers of truth, the Quran remained unchanged. Recited in every corner of the world in the same language and words revealed more than 14 centuries ago. The death of the Prophet marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a legacy that would outlive empires and dynasties. The companions, though grieving, carried forward his mission with unwavering resolve, knowing that their trust was no longer in one man, but in the message he had delivered. Through their sacrifices, the Quran became not just a book, but a living reality, guiding prayer, shaping law, and inspiring hearts in every generation that followed. In the years that followed the Prophet's passing and the careful preservation of the Quran into a single manuscript, the message of Islam began to move beyond the confines of Arabia. What had once been a small community in Mecca, persecuted and driven to secrecy, now stood as a rapidly expanding civilization fueled not by conquest alone, but by a transformative message that spoke to the human soul. The Quran, recited in the same melodic Arabic in which it was revealed, became the heart of this expansion. It was not carried merely as a text, but as a living experience, memorized and recited by men, women, and children whose lives were shaped by its verses. As caravans set forth to distant lands and armies marched to secure the borders of the new Muslim state, the Quran traveled with them not as a relic of the past, but as a guiding light for the present and the future. Under the leadership of Abu Bakr and later Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Muslim community transformed from a fledgling group into a polity stretching across vast territories. Cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, and later Cairo and Baghdad came under the banner of Islam. But it was not swords alone that won hearts, it was the moral revolution carried by the Quran. Its call to justice resonated with the oppressed in Byzantine and Persian lands. Its emphasis on charity and equality struck chords in societies long stratified by class and lineage. And its insistence on the dignity of every human being offered hope to slaves and outcasts. Unlike many conquerors who imposed their cultures upon the defeated, the Muslims carried a message that uplifted and transformed without erasing local traditions, as long as those traditions did not violate the principles of justice and monotheism. As Islam spread, so too did the recitation of the Quran. It was heard in the mosques of Medina and the palaces of Damascus, on the lips of shepherds in North Africa and merchants in the markets of Persia. Entire generations dedicated their lives to memorizing it, preserving it not only in written form but within the living hearts of the faithful. This oral tradition became one of Islam's greatest strengths. No matter where Muslims went, the melody of the Quran remained unchanged, unaltered by time or geography. Scholars developed precise sciences of tajweed, the rules of recitation, to ensure every letter and vowel was pronounced exactly as the Prophet had recited it. This meticulous care meant that even as empires rose and fell, the Quran itself remained untouchable, immune to corruption or loss. Centuries passed, and the Quran became the cornerstone of a civilization that contributed immeasurably to the world. Inspired by its emphasis on knowledge and reflection, Muslim scholars pioneered advances in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Universities like Al-Qarawiyyin and Al-Azhar emerged as centers of learning, attracting students from across continents. The Quran's verses urging contemplation of the heavens spurred advancements in astronomy. Its calls for justice informed legal systems, Its reverence for life influenced hospitals and charitable institutions. Through translation, commentary, and dialogue, the Quran's moral and intellectual framework quietly shaped human thought far beyond the boundaries of the Muslim world. Yet despite its universal reach, the Quran never lost its intimate, personal impact. A farmer in the fields of Andalusia could find solace in the same verses that comforted a scholar in Baghdad. A mother in the deserts of Arabia teaching her child to recite Surah Al-Fatiha was participating in the same legacy as countless generations before her. In every era of hardship, wars, invasions, colonialism, the Quran served as an anchor, reminding believers of their purpose and connecting them to a tradition larger than themselves. The Mongol invasions, the fall of Baghdad, even the fragmentation of Muslim lands could not sever this bond. Wherever Muslims went, the Quran went with them, carried not just in their books but in their prayers, their language, and their hearts. Today, more than 14 centuries after the first command to read was uttered in the cave of Hira, the Quran remains the most memorized book in the world, recited daily by millions in every corner of the globe. Its verses are heard in the call to prayer echoing through bustling cities and quiet villages alike, in the whispers of the devout at dawn and the collective voices of worshippers in Ramadan nights. Despite the passage of time, the words remain unchanged, their rhythm undiminished, their relevance undimmed. For believers, this continuity is not mere tradition, it is a living miracle, a testament to the divine promise that the Quran would be preserved, uncorrupted, until the end of time. But beyond the rituals and recitations, the Quran continues to call humanity to something deeper, a life of purpose, justice, and compassion. Its timeless themes speak as urgently today as they did in the deserts of 7th century Arabia: to care for the orphan, to honor the dignity of every human soul, to stand firm against oppression, to remember that this fleeting life is but a prelude to an eternal one. In every age, its words challenge hearts to rise above selfishness and heedlessness, to see beyond divisions of race and tribe, and to recognize the shared humanity rooted in our Creator. The story of the Quran is not simply a historical timeline, it is a living continuum. It began with a solitary man seeking truth in a mountain cave, and grew into a revelation that reshaped the course of human history. It carried a persecuted people from the shadows of oppression to the heights of moral leadership, and it continues to illuminate the path for those who seek meaning in a world often clouded by noise and distraction. As it was said 14 centuries ago and still rings true today, indeed, this Quran guides to that which is most upright, and so long as hearts continue to turn toward its words, the light that began in the silent night of Hira will never be extinguished.